Hi there, and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, a podcast about football finance, governance, and politics with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm an investigative journalist and West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, and I'm joined as always by Charlie Methven. Charlie is Charlton Athletics co-owner, a former director of Sunderland, one-time advisor to Tottenham Hotspur, and a boyhood Oxford United fan. And this week, we're going to be looking at Manchester City's so-called trial of the century. The club is facing 115 charges from the Premier League for alleged breaches of financial rules, charges which the club strenuously denies. And if we've got time, we'll be looking at claims that UEFA could ban England from playing in its own forthcoming Euros. First, though, the weekend's football. And Charlie, another 3 points for Charlton Athletic on the road at Shrewsbury. And only 3 goals conceded in 6 games. Last season, you had one of the leakiest defences in the league. So what's happened there?
Well, and of those 3 goals, Adrian, 2 of them have been from 30 yards. So there's only been 1 goal, what I would call a conventional goal, scored against the Charlton Athletic defence over 6 games. And I guess probably the answer to your question lies in your original premise, which is we had one of the leakiest defences in the league before Nathan Jones arrived at the club in early February of this year. And he has sort of systematically set about repairing that situation, sort of rather in the manner that George Graham did when he first came to Arsenal back in the sort of mid to late 1980s. You know, build from the back, make sure you're tight, make sure you can keep clean sheets, and then gradually build an attacking threat. And I think that the latter bit, as Nathan said in his interview after the game yesterday, is somewhat a work in progress. In terms of, you know, we are not yet a free-flowing attacking force. But as you know from West Brom over the last year or two under Corberan, if you are organised and difficult to score against, and every game becomes a possible win, you aren't throwing the game at the opposition, then actually you can pick up an awful lot of points, because it's extraordinary how often, as that sort of game progresses, that you do have your moments in that game. I think there's also the intangible benefit that comes to the rest of the team from knowing that the players behind them aren't about to make a massive mistake. There's a sort of gradual growth in confidence that you can compete in every game, and you're not going to need to score 3 goals a game. So I think the change in mentality comes from the change in structure and some of the changes in personnel, and that's led to what in points terms is a very good start to the season. But I would caution it's still early days. You know, they always used to say, didn't they, back in the day, don't look at the table until you're 10 matches in. And we are 6 matches in. So we're still 3 weeks away, really, from being able to say, you know, sometime in early October, okay, right, well, after a quarter of the season, where are we? Baggies, we're not playing yesterday.
No, so as we're recording this, I'm looking forward to a game away at Portsmouth. So my Saturday afternoon football fix was gained for the 2nd week in a row at a non-league ground. I went to see Church, who beat Cheltenham in the FA Cup a couple of years ago, a village team, as they're described, on the edge of Birmingham. They beat local rivals Halesoe in town 1-0 in the Southern Premier Central. So that's 2 divisions below the National League North and South. I have to say, it wasn't a great game, but it was my first visit to Lye Meadow, and a crowd of 700 odd there. And Church went top of the league. So if they carry on that way, they'd be in the National League North or South next season, which would be a big step up for them. But, you know, it was a lovely afternoon in the sunshine watching football, which is what Saturday afternoons are all about. Let's talk about Manchester City then, Charlie. And we were chatting before we started recording, saying over the next few weeks, this is going to be an inescapable football story. In fact, I'm going to put this podcast out a little earlier than usual, because I know there'll be huge interest around this story over the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, look, Adrian, I think there's going to be huge interest that surrounds the start of this. My suspicion is it will then go quiet for a number of weeks, because effectively the hearings will be held in secret. In fact, nobody even knows where they're taking place. And I'd imagine it'd be some time before anything, if anything, starts to leak out apropos of what way it's going or any concerns either side might have, all this type of stuff. So I think probably between where we are now in mid-September and mid-October, it will probably somewhat drift off the news agenda because there won't be much new happening. And then as we get towards late autumn and the winter, with an expected verdict due at the end of this year or right at the start of next year, the interest will really start to gather pace then, and probably the rumour mill will start in earnest. But I think it'd just be useful perhaps for us to discuss and to remind our listeners of where the story starts. This is not a bolt from the blue.
No, Manchester City, I think, as you say, Charlie, it's worth going back right to the start of the ownership of the club by the United Arab Emirates. And people will think, well, aren't Manchester City owned by people from Abu Dhabi? They are, but Abu Dhabi, for people who don't know, is the biggest component of the United Arab Emirates. So if you govern Abu Dhabi, in effect, you govern the UAE. So for the purposes of this podcast, I think it's fair to reference the UAE. And that is a deeply repressive state. We discussed that we discussed similar issues in relation to Saudi Arabia recently. So the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, wants to improve its image abroad, wants to sports wash its reputation, to put it in simple terms, and also wants to extend its economic influence around the world, preparing for a post-fossil fuel economy. So that's part of what they're about in being involved in Manchester City. And I made a documentary for Radio 4 looking at the way in which the UAE had bought, for example, real estate in Manchester, partly brokered through connections which it had generated through owning Manchester City. So that's important stuff, and I don't want to dismiss it. But as we're here to talk about the football-related part of that, that's just to explain how the UAE gets involved with Manchester City in the first place. 2008, and these owners really want to make a difference to the club.
Yeah, and I think probably very few people in football understood the seismic implications of the takeover of a football club by a sovereign state. And you're right, it was largely because it wasn't really depicted in that way. I think it probably took a little while for most people in the industry, maybe in the government, to understand that actually Man City had not been taken over by a wealthy person from the UAE. It had actually been taken over by the UAE. And from that has sprung all sorts of debates, consequences, things. But at the heart of it was the original intention. So the original intention, I think, a little bit different from what we discussed with Saudi, or at least more specific. Unlike Saudi, the UAE had already begun its move away from being entirely oil revenue dependent. It's a major financial center in the Middle East, and it's a major tourism destination within the Middle East. It had already made peace with the idea of having Western tourists come there and be allowed to drink alcohol and be allowed to have women allowed to wear bikinis on beaches and all this type of stuff. That had already happened by 2008. And effectively, with their giant state airline, Etihad, and investment funds and all this type of stuff, the UAE effectively thought, well, there is a vehicle which can promote all of these things and us as a country, as a tourism destination, as a finance direct destination, as a destination for sports events and sporting excellence and all these types of things. And having a Premier League football club and investing what is a very large amount of money by football club standards, but actually a relatively small amount of money by the standards of investment in these very large industries, we can really make a difference to, frankly, brand awareness, brand attractiveness, all sorts of these things. And off they went on their merry way. Now, the problem is that these were the times, around the times, when spending regulations started to be introduced. And probably to a degree, people at City Football Group would say that part of the reasons for spending regulations being introduced was precisely because of their entry into the market. And it was protectionism from the very biggest clubs, both in Britain and Europe, to try and stop them from being able to compete as they would see it. or as the historic clubs would say, being put on financial steroids in order to compete falsely, as they would see it. So this arm wrestle, this row, goes back 15, 20 years to when Abu Dhabi first bought Man City. And all of the arguments about whether sovereign states should or shouldn't be allowed to buy clubs in the Premier League, and therefore the whole Saudi Arabia, Newcastle thing, etc. A large chunk of Saudi's argument in that was, well, you've already allowed it through Man City, so why would you not allow us to do the same? You've already set the precedent.
And as you
So
say,
there's been a
Charlie, at the time, it was not clear that it was being bought by the UAE, was it? The company that bought Manchester City was called the Abu Dhabi United Group, which is notionally an independent company, but a bit like the public investment fund that owns Newcastle United. We're talking about a state where nothing really happens without the say-so of the leader. And I think most people now would acknowledge that Manchester City are effectively a vehicle of the United Arab Emirates. And although they are run by Sheikh Mansour, who is the chairman, MBZ, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is the
bin Zayed.
Sorry,
Mohammed
Crown
bin Zayed.
Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed is effectively the top dog in the UAE and ultimately calls the shots on this project. So we're at this situation then early on where they want to make a splash with City. And we'll talk about the specific allegations in a moment, but I think it's just worth reflecting, isn't it, that a lot have described the UAE as a deeply repressive state, and it is. And people who try and speak out against the government have been imprisoned without trial. It's not a state, I think, that anybody listening to this podcast would choose to live in terms of its freedoms and democratic norms. But the change that the UAE have wrought in East Manchester is impressive. It's truly transformative. The site on which the Etihad stands, and a lot of that work, I should say, for the Manchester City Stadium was funded by the taxpayer. It wasn't funded by the UAE. This was pre the UAE, and it was a project to regenerate East Manchester at the time of the Commonwealth Games. So the taxpayer paid for the development of the stadium. City had quite a strong negotiating hand at the time because they didn't need to leave Main Road, but the council were quite keen to trade the land and regenerate Moss Side in Manchester. So City got a very good deal on the stadium pre the UAE taking over. But since then, a combination of the UAE and public money has helped to develop a really amazing campus in East Manchester. And I just think it's worth, as balance, saying that what was a very rundown and derelict post-industrial area in East Manchester is now a showpiece sports and entertainment complex with various venues, a velodrome, a second stadium where City's women's team play, which 7,000 capacity, better than many League Two and National League grounds.
Yeah, that's all absolutely true. There's no disputing anything that you've said just now, and this is the thing, isn't it? The whole project has been a massive success. I just want to talk a little bit about what the project actually is, over and above it being a branding exercise for Abu Dhabi, on a more detailed football level, right? So how successful has this been? Well, you've got to look more broadly than just Manchester City. You've got to look at something called City Football Group. And City Football Group owns 13 teams across 5 continents. They own teams in Uruguay. They own teams in Belgium. They own teams in India, Australia, etc., etc., etc. And the original idea of this, actually, it was set up and administered by a man called Brian Marwood, who you may remember being a winger for Arsenal and Sheffield Wednesday in our youth, ran the PFA as well, and went on to become a executive at, I think, either Nike or Adidas. And Brian was sort of mandated to set up this terrifically far-sighted project long before other multi-club operations had come to the fore. And the idea is that they would sort of create this extraordinary player development pipeline across the world which would mean that in the end, Man City became self-sufficient as these young players were bought and moved between their clubs until the point at which they became good enough to play for the Man City first team. And then they would graduate into the Man City first team, and Man City would therefore not need to buy 70, 80, 90, 100 million pound players because they would develop them themselves. And basically, that project has actually been, in and of itself, quite successful. So the City Football Group has become a remarkable combine. The irony is that when Pep Guardiola came, he made it very clear that he wanted to have nothing to do with the system whatsoever. So City Football Group effectively became almost like a separate business where they were developing young players and trading young players without those players actually ever going anywhere near the Man City first team. But they nonetheless have been some remarkable successes. From what I understand, as a business alone, that is a profitable business. City Football Group's other clubs other than Man City are basically successful. And I think it's not implausible to think of a time in the future, particularly as various cost regulations come into play on all clubs, that perhaps the original model might be revisited, by which Man City does start to draw more of its talent from the network of clubs that it's established across the world. And it did so in a remarkably thoughtful way, Adrian. I remember visiting their club in Uruguay. They could easily have, bought one of the bigger clubs in Uruguay. I mean, not the biggest because these are owned by fans, but nonetheless, they could have bought one of the bigger clubs in Uruguay. But they didn't. They deliberately bought basically a nothing club in the third division because they didn't really want to have a large fan base querying why the club was being used as a feeder club. They wanted to develop a club from nothing and then have it. It was obviously going to take longer to do it that way, but in the end, they'd end up with something that was much more bespoke to what City was trying to do. And this has been repeated across many different countries. They got into countries and basically started new teams or taken over small teams and used them for their purpose rather than the ego trick of other multi-club offerings. Say, well, we want to buy the biggest brand names. No, they were like, no, our brand is City. That's our brand. And all these other clubs need to be supportive of that. So City Football Group has been built up over the last 15 years into this really remarkable organisation and a very successful one. Then you got Man City itself, which, as I said, was sort of already on the road towards success before Pep came in. And then when Pep came in, he was obviously given assurances by Abu Dhabi because they knew they were hiring the greatest manager in the world. Well, obviously we will, quote, back you. And that's, in a way, when the spending tap really went on, it's when it became sort of, right, we are now going to be buying 100 million pound players, etc., because that's the only way we keep Pep, because Pep has to win the Champions League, etc. And the whole thing was on a gradient towards when the club would first win the Champions League. And effectively, not going to when the club would win the Champions League, it's when Abu Dhabi would win the Champions League, because the unspoken truth about this whole process is that Man City no longer really exists. It's simply a brand front for Abu Dhabi. All of the club's historic legacy of being a blue-collar, gritty underdog club that you and I used to go to Main Road. I'm sure I did, certainly, as an away fan, and it was one of the grittiest, toughest away venues you could possibly go to. Fantastic atmosphere from the Kipats, etc. Really amazing, but bears zero resemblance to what is there today. Absolutely zero. And it is now Abu Dhabi. It's Abu Dhabi wearing a light blue shirt with Etihad on the front. And yes, there's a Man City crest in the corner, but it's got nothing to do with Man City anymore. Let's not kid ourselves that it does. So once Abu Dhabi won the Champions League, effectively, the whole project was complete. It is now absolutely associated with ultimate sporting success. And Abu Dhabi is therefore associated with success, sporting success, excellence, and all these types of things.
I think it's worth, I might quibble with that a little bit because, of course, the support is still essentially the same. I'm sure the experience of being a Manchester City fan has changed quite dramatically. City fans were known for their downbeat humour, for being incredibly loyal when Manchester United under Fergie were winning everything. There was a fantastic buy-in from Manchester City fans to their club during those years when, you may remember, Charlie, they even dropped down to the third tier, the equivalent of League One. And in the same season that United won the European Cup, beating Bayern Munich with those two late goals in that same season. City got out of League One only by beating Gillingham on penalties. And I think they were losing late on in the game at Wembley as well. So, but City fans, I think, had a fantastic reputation. And I think, to be fair to City fans, of success changes everybody. And I'm sure there's a degree of entitlement now, a degree of expectation. When you've won 4 Premier Leagues in a row, that's bound to happen. But I hear what you're saying, but the fan base is still the working class fan base of sort of South and East Manchester, isn't it? It may have a bit more on top, new people who've come in, and that's going to happen in football, more tourists.
Yeah, not too much. I think it's probably the same fans. I'm talking about brand. So I'm talking about
Yeah.
how that badge is perceived by people outside of the actual current fan base and historic fan base is no longer perceived as being the humorous, gritty underdog, whatever it might be. It is perceived as being Abu Dhabi's club. And for those of us who go there in person, of course, you then see that there are normal Manchester fans there, but they are nothing more than a backdrop.
It should be said, I think, as well, again, before we talk about the allegations of football, Pep Guardiola has revolutionized English football, the way he plays. He plays out from the back in a way that isn't. I see non-league teams playing out from the back. I think it's very easy to forget.
Trying to play.
Well, indeed, and sometimes succeeding. But even teams low down now, that has kind of become the default mode of professional football in England. And when it started, what? Just clear your lines, man. Get it out from the back. If in doubt, kick it out. That's what I was taught as a young footballer. It was the default mode of English football. And Pep Guardiola changed that completely. And not only did he change it by saying, well, we want to play in a different way, he was hugely successful with it. And that is the point, isn't it? You can play out from the back, play this kind of football, possession-based football, and still be massively successful. So I think he has been a revolutionary in that sense, in tactical terms. And City at their best have been a magnificent team. Aguero, Silva, De Bruyne. Those of us old enough to remember the likes of Franny Lee and Colin Bell will know that these are not the first generation of great City players, but they have been a joy to watch in a way that I would argue that Chelsea, who have also been very successful in this modern era under Mourinho, were not particularly thrilling to watch. But City at their best have been brilliant, to be fair, under Pep. So,
well, look, I think just to sort of conclude this conversation before we get on to the meat of the charges, there's no doubt everything you say is right. Pep is a tactical mastermind. Do I find them thrilling to watch? Not really. They compress the game into half of the pitch. They are amazing at understanding when and how to press. Extraordinary at their micro movements, so little 2-yard movements to be able to receive the ball and all this type of stuff. Is that the most exciting form of football? Probably not. You'd say Klopp's style, where the game gets more stretched and the ball travels, in transition much quicker, and all that type of stuff is probably a more exciting way. But ultimately, Pep has won many more titles playing this way, and there's a sense of inevitability about City victories, which is what portrays ultimate tactical success. But it has been built off the back of massive spending. And that has to be seen and acknowledged. That's a fact. And that fundamentally is what this dispute, this case is all about. It's about massive spending. And this goes back a long, long time. So if you think that in 2012, 12 years ago, the profit and sustainability rules were brought in by the Premier League. So that's 4 years after the Abu Dhabi takeover of Man City. In 2014, City were charged by UEFA and fined. In 2018, the Premier League opened its first investigation after the whole Spiegel, you remember the football leaks, Spiegel sort of revelations and all that type of stuff. Then in 2020, UEFA issued their 2-year ban on City entering European competitions, and City referred that to the Court of Arbitration Sport, who then overturned that ban and replaced it with a fine. And then in 2022, City were charged by the Premier League, who have been having an investigation into them for quite some time by that point. I mean, I think we're talking about going back to 2018 again. So that was 4 years of investigation. And here we are 2 years later with the case about to be heard. So this is 6 years that this has been going on for at Premier League level, but 10 years or more that it's been going on for as a ongoing rumbling dispute in football, whether it be through UEFA or through the Premier League, but always concerning Man City. And in a way, this is the moment when these arguments can be put to bed, because there are 115 charges. It's comprehensive. It stretches back right towards the start of City's time in the Premier League, and particularly dates to the start of the PSR rules in 2012. And, you know, ultimately, if the Premier League makes these charges stick, then not only will there be obviously very significant punishment for City, but also will put a marker down, effectively a validation that the Premier League and presumably subsequently UEFA are going to be able to hold clubs to account on what they see as the interpretation of their rules. If, on the other hand, the Premier League fail to make these charges stick and City get cleared on all 115 charges, or on a vast majority of them, it ends up with a relatively small kind of punishment, then I think that will be interpreted as basically saying, well, that there's just no way of getting these clubs to conform to any type of rules, is how it will be perceived in the industry, which will then have obviously other knock-on effects and impacts going down the track. So I think that sort of sets the scene. Are you sort of aware, Adrian, of what the various different charges are?
Well, some of the charges relate to failure to provide accurate financial information. Some of them relate to failure to provide accurate details for payments to players and managers. Some of them relate to failure to comply with UEFA's rules relating to financial fair play. Some of them relate to breaching PSR rules in the Premier League. And then 35 of the charges relate to failure to cooperate with the Premier League. And I find that interesting in that even if City were cleared of all the other charges, and as I say, they strenuously deny them, failure to cooperate is one I suspect their lawyers might find more difficult to get around. Who knows?
Well, I guess it all depends on what their justification is for the reluctance to release information. You know, they might say, well, the reason why we didn't release information when we were asked to release information is because we didn't believe it was going to be treated in the right way, or we believe that there was some sort of witch hunt against us, or whatever it might be. It's very difficult to say what the case for defence is going to be. But I think what you've just outlined there quite accurately is the sheer breadth of the charges and the length of time, and effectively, it sort of breaks down as two parts, doesn't it? On the one hand is what they actually did, allegedly, did or didn't sort of breach the spending rules. And the second part of it was if they actually sort of either reported it accurately or even agreed to send documentation over at all. And so maybe there are even three parts to this, because you know those latter two parts are almost sort of two separate subsets of the same type of offence. So you know, ultimately, I think it's reasonably well known this relates to various different issues. One of which is the way in which sponsorship by state companies is treated. You know, are those genuine sponsorships, and particularly are the levels which those sponsorships are paid at, are they authentic? Would that be the case if it was not a state-owned entity? So is it effectively cloaking owner funding as sponsorship funding, which obviously helps from a PSR perspective? And then, so the other side of it is obviously to do with the way in which they paid managers and players rather earlier on in the piece. And this has been a long sort of standing sort of rumor, complaint, charge, whatever it might be, that they would, let's say, have an employee, and they would say, let's say it was a very highly attractive employee, either a player or a manager, and they'd say, right, well, City will pay you this amount, but you will also receive a consultancy from this other entity over here, which will then make up the difference effectively. And only the City bit would count towards the PSR regulations, and the consultancy wouldn't. So that's another historic allegation. You and I can't know whether that's true or not, or fair or not, or whatever it might be. But that goes back again right towards the earlier days of their ownership of the club. So those are the two main sort of spending bits that are going to be examined in detail. And then on the other side of it, as we said, is the reporting side of it. First of all, were those things financially reported accurately when it came submitting the financial information to the Premier League, UEFA, etc. And then the other bit of it being, once the investigation was opened, was documentation passed across to those governing bodies when it was asked for.
Yes. And like you, Charlie, I've spoken to City fans who feel that they have been unfairly targeted, who feel that the traditional club, the old guard of European Cup winning clubs like Real Madrid, for example, have inspired some of the animus against them, particularly at UEFA level. And UEFA's charges against them, as you say, they were ruled out of time. It wasn't that UEFA's charges were not valid. City's argument was these charges are out of time. And when they were tried over these issues and took them to the Court of Arbitration in Sport, CAS said, yep, they're out of time. City did accept, I think, a £10,000 or €10,000 fine. Sorry?
10 million.
10 million. City did accept a 10 million euro fine. 10 million.
No, that's correct. And it's important to note that statute of limitations does not apply under Premier League rules. Yeah. So that they won't get away with that one. That defence won't be able to come back. So this is going to be heard in full and on the detail of the charges. I think the City fans are correct to say, I noticed Pep was saying only yesterday that, of course, as they say, infamy, they've all got it infamy. They have a well-founded victim sort of mentality on this one, which is they think that everybody else is out to get them. But of course, that is only to be expected, because if it were the case, and I'm not saying it is, but if it were the case that they have systematically been cheating for the last 10 years, then the clubs that have got it in for them are the clubs that would have won those titles and would have therefore have materially different, lives and financial lives. And in fact, the lives of their fans would be materially different over those 10, 12, 14 years. So I think, yes, other clubs do have it in for City. Where I would slightly demur is to say that is necessarily illogical. If it is the case that they have been cheating, then absolutely it would be expected. Just like when you speak to Sharon Davis, the swimmer, who would have won multiple gold medals if the East German female swimmers hadn't been taking drugs. Of course, Sharon Davis feels very bitter about the gold medals that she never won. It changed her life. She was not there on top of the podium because other people had cheated. I don't think many people feel that her sense of bitterness is unjustified. So once these charges are decided upon, there is no appeal to CAS on this. This is a straightforward decision. I imagine it can probably be appealed under British law in some way, shape or form, maybe even taken to Supreme Court or something like that. But broadly speaking, this decision is this decision. It's a domestic decision, and the decision will be made, and that will pretty much be that.
Well, we should see what happens. I certainly think that Everton and Nottingham Forest fans, whose clubs have been deducted points for breaches of PSR in the last year or so, will be looking at this with a very keen eye, as will we. We'll be back again next week. Thank you so much for listening. Check out more at my Substack, adriangoldberg.substack.com. My book, Where's the Money Gone?, is perennially forthcoming. And thank you to Charlie. Thank you to Mark Machado for the vocal, for the socials. What, Charlie?
I'd just like to say before we sign off, it's just worth bearing in mind the potential scale of these penalties is way, 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 way in advance of what happened to Forest and Everton. We're not talking about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points. If they were to get found guilty of these charges, we're talking about something epochally large in terms of punishment. Not that they necessarily will be found guilty of it, but if it does happen, you're looking at something much more dramatic than a few points here or there.
Great to hear from you, Charlie. Thank you very much indeed. We'll see you again next week. Cheers now. Bye-bye.